They found the letter in the earth, pressed flat beneath a rusted mess tin and the curve of a shattered helmet. The paper was thin as bark, the ink almost bled to brown, yet the handwriting survived, small, careful, almost gentle in its loops. It had lain there since 1916, beneath the churned clay of Verdun, where men once vanished into smoke and soil as if swallowed by the world itself. The archaeologists said the handwriting belonged to a young French soldier, 19, maybe 20, whose remains had been unearthed among others. His name was stitched to a scrap of uniform, Julien Mercier, 132nd Infantry. But the letter wasn't addressed to his family. It began simply, "To whoever finds what's left of us." Reading those words today feels like stepping into a silence too vast to measure. Verdun is quiet now, its woods green again, its trenches softened by moss. Yet in that letter, the earth still trembles. How does one speak for the dead when even the ground has already tried to forget? The voice you are about to hear is mine, Claire Mercier, great-grandniece of the boy who never came home. My grandmother used to keep a photograph of him above the mantel, a slim youth in a worn cap, eyes too solemn for his age. For years, I believed him to be a myth, one of those half-remembered family ghosts that drift through stories told after supper. But last spring, a historian from Verdun sent us the news. They had found Julien's remains during a small excavation near Fort Douaumont. Alongside his body, wrapped in fragments of oilcloth, was the letter. When the envelope arrived, my hands trembled. I had expected the paper to smell of damp, of rot. Instead, it smelled faintly of soil and iron, like rain on old stone. And so I read it, the words of a boy who had written not for his mother nor his country, but for the strangers who might someday walk above him. To whoever finds what's left of us. Julien began his letter without ceremony, without fear, as though he were merely describing the weather to a neighbor leaning over a fence. Yet the tone carried something beyond acceptance, a strange peace that only comes to those who have lived too long in chaos. He wrote that it was late February and the sky had not cleared for 10 days. The men were sunk knee-deep in mud that smelled of metal and decay. Their food had run low, their sleep came in shards between bombardments. But what he described most vividly was not the horror, it was the stillness that followed it. When the guns stop, he wrote, you hear everything. The dripping in the dugout, the breathing of men who dream of fields they'll never see again, and sometimes the wind carries the bells from villages that no longer exist. He mentioned a friend named Lucien, who had once been a schoolteacher. During the quiet hours, Lucien sketched the meadows near their hometown. Julien wrote, he draws flowers, says if he keeps drawing them, they won't die. I think he wants to remember what color looks like. There was a pause in his words, a visible space left between sentences, before he added simply, Lucien was buried yesterday. From that moment, the letter deepened. Julien began to speak of the war as if it were not a thing happening to him, but a weather system passing through, relentless, impersonal, beyond reason. It rains shells, and we wait for the clearing. I think sometimes we mistake patience for courage. He described how, after each bombardment, the men would dig out the living from beneath what remained. Some they found breathing, others only seemed to be. He never used the word dead. Instead, he said, they've gone to quieter ground. Then came a confession, almost childlike in its honesty. I used to pray every night, he wrote, but now I only whisper. I don't know to whom. Maybe to the ground, since it's the only thing that listens. Near the letter's end, the sentences softened, as if his hand had grown tired. The ink faded where his quill must have run dry. If this is found, he said, tell my mother not to search for me. The earth already has. Tell her I am not lost. I am among thousands, and we are no longer afraid. The shells no longer reach us here. And then, at the very bottom, a single line written faintly, almost invisible now. Plant something where I fell, anything that grows. When I reached that part, I could no longer read. I sat with the letter open on my lap, the house around me utterly still. It was strange. I could hear the tick of the clock, the whisper of the wind through the window pane, and for a moment it was as if the world itself were pausing to listen. I thought about how he must have written those words, perhaps under the dim light of a guttering candle, his hands trembling from cold, his boots soaked, his breath visible in the chill air. And yet, he had written plant something. Not remember me, not avenge me, but simply let something live where I died. That was the truest thing about the letter. It was not about death. It was about the quiet defiance of life. About how, even beneath the weight of earth, something still wishes to bloom. And perhaps that is why, when the archaeologists uncovered his remains, the ground above him was dotted with small yellow wildflowers, the kind that grow without invitation, persistent and bright against the grey. When I first set foot in Verdun, the earth felt heavier than any place I had ever known. It wasn't sorrow exactly, more a kind of quiet density, as though the ground still held its breath after more than a century. The hills were green, almost gentle, but each step pressed into history. Beneath the roots of grass and the patient spread of trees lay the bones of thousands who had once been boys, like Julian. I carried a copy of his letter in the pocket of my coat. It was folded carefully, as though creases could bruise it. The original, sealed now in glass, remained at home, safe from the damp. But I wanted his words with me, not as proof, but as company. Dr. Lefebvre, the lead archaeologist, met me at the site. He was a quiet man, the kind who measured his words the way others measure breath. He led me down a narrow path that wound through the remains of the trench line. Time had softened the edges, but you could still trace where the walls once stood, where men had crouched for hours beneath the earth. "It's strange," he said, kneeling near a shallow pit. "You can still find traces here, buttons, buckles, bits of cloth. The soil remembers what we forget." I looked down at the small depression where Julian had been found. It wasn't much, a patch of disturbed soil, darker than the rest. But to me, it felt infinite. The thought that someone I shared blood with had lain there, silent and unseen for over 100 years, was almost unbearable. Dr. Lefebvre showed me a small wooden box containing what they had recovered: a rusted comb, the dented mess tin, and the oilcloth that had once protected the letter. There was also a fragment of a locket, the metal corroded, the image within barely visible. It showed a woman with a baby in her arms. There was no name written on it, no note, only an echo of tenderness surviving the ruin. "We find these things often," he said softly. Each one a conversation cut short. I crouched and touched the soil with my fingertips. It was damp and cool, smelling faintly of moss and iron. For a moment, I imagined him there. Julian, 19, his uniform torn, his letter folded inside his pocket. Around him, the night alive with noise, rain, mud, whispered prayers, the unending thunder of shells, and then silence. There was something sacred in that silence. Not the solemnity of death, but the strange grace of continuation. The grass had grown back, birds called from the trees. A butterfly drifted near my shoulder, absurdly bright, its wings flickering like fire. The world had kept moving. Later that day, I walked alone through the ossuary at Douaumont. Inside, glass panels revealed the mingled bones of thousands, femurs, skulls, fragments of a generation. I stood there, my reflection mingling with theirs, and felt an ache that had no name. My hands pressed against the glass, and I thought of the words Julian had written. "Tell her I am not lost. I am among thousands." He had not exaggerated. Outside, near the memorial wall, small yellow flowers grew in clusters, pushing up through cracks in the stone. I recognized them immediately, the same wildflowers that had dotted the field above his resting place. They were modest things, their petals bright against the grey. I bent down and traced one with my finger. It trembled in the breeze, unafraid. That night I stayed in a small inn overlooking the Meuse. The room was simple, wooden floors, white curtains, the faint smell of rain. I placed Julian's copied letter on the table beside the lamp and read it again, slowly this time. With each line I could feel the distance between us folding, years collapsing into a single breath. And somewhere between the words and the silence, I understood. The letter was not meant to haunt. It was meant to remind. Julian did not write for pity or for remembrance. He wrote so that the living would keep planting, so that life, in its small and stubborn forms, would reclaim the ground where war had taken everything. When I finally closed my eyes, the wind outside carried the faintest sound, not of bells this time, but of leaves brushing against each other in the dark. It sounded like a whisper, perhaps his. When I returned to France the following spring, Verdun had already changed again. The air was warmer, the trees fuller, and the trenches that once felt haunted now carried birdsong. Yet even in the peace of that landscape, I felt the same low hum, a vibration beneath the calm, like something not yet finished speaking. I went back to the place where Julian's remains had been reinterred. The small wooden cross stood at the edge of a meadow, its surface worn by rain. Someone, perhaps a local caretaker, perhaps a passerby, had left a sprig of wild thyme tied with twine at its base. The scent rose gently in the air. I sat in the grass for a long time, my back against the stone marker, the letter once more in my hands. It was hard to believe these were the words of a boy who had never seen his 20th birthday. They were too still, too wise, as though the war itself had stripped away the need for youth. But what I thought about most that day was not his death. It was what had followed, the years of silence that blanketed his name. My grandmother had lived her whole life not knowing where her uncle had fallen. For her, he was a name on a photograph, a story half told. And now, here I was, the one who had found him, or rather been found by him. It's strange how absence grows roots. For decades, my family carried a hollow where Julian should have been. We never spoke of him much. War, for them, was something folded into the past and hidden in drawers. But that letter changed everything. It reopened the silence, not as a wound, but as a space to remember. When I read it aloud to my grandmother before she passed, she closed her eyes and whispered, "He was always the gentle one." She had been a child when he left for the front, too young to understand the finality of goodbyes. Her voice trembled when she heard his words, "Plant something where I fell." Afterward, she said something that stayed with me. Perhaps he wasn't asking for flowers. Perhaps he was asking us to go on living. That thought carried me as I walked through the memorial forest that day. Thousands of trees, planted after the war, marked where men had once stood. Each trunk bore the scars of growth, moss climbing like memory up the bark, branches stretching toward a sky that had once been blackened by fire. I thought of Lucien, the boy who drew flowers in his sketchbook, and wondered if any of his drawings survived. Maybe somewhere, in an attic in Reims or Metz, a faded notebook rests beneath dust. Small blooms sketched by candlelight while the world fell apart around them. The echoes of Verdun are not loud ones. They live in subtler places, the shift of wind through long grass, the uneven hum of bees, the faint shimmer of light on shell-pocked soil. You begin to realize that absence itself can speak, if you are still enough to listen. At dusk, I walked toward the river. The Meuse flowed quietly, indifferent yet eternal. I knelt and dipped my fingers into the current. It was cold, but alive. I imagined it carrying traces of that long-ago mud, fragments of rusted steel, particles of bone, all moving downstream into the heart of the country. Life, rejoining life. As I stood there, a storm began to gather on the horizon, low clouds bruising the edge of the sky. For a moment, thunder rolled faintly, echoing across the valley. It sounded distant, but familiar, and for an instant, I could almost hear it, as he might have, not as violence, but as memory. Julian's voice, written in that letter, was never meant for history books. It was meant for the living, for anyone who might stumble across his words and feel, even briefly, the pulse beneath the soil. The war ended, but the echo remains, not to torment, but to remind. It has been 2 years since I first held Julian's letter in my hands, and I still read it sometimes, always aloud, always slowly, as though the air itself needs time to absorb the sound of his words. It sits now framed above my writing desk, beside the photograph my grandmother once kept by the hearth. In it, Julian stands in uniform, his cap tilted slightly, his gaze calm but alert. The photograph is creased and yellowed at the corners, but his eyes, those grey, steady eyes, have not faded. After the excavation, the town of Verdun invited our family to attend the reburial ceremony. It was a quiet affair. No speeches, no parades, only the sound of the wind threading through the grass. There were perhaps a dozen families there, each holding photographs of young men who had vanished into the same soil. When the chaplain finished his brief prayer, we stood in silence. Then someone, I think it was one of the local children, placed a small pot of lavender near the grave. Its scent rose softly, like the faintest breath of home. I remember the way the sun broke through the clouds at that moment, the way it fell across the rows of crosses. The light caught on the metal tags and made them gleam. As if for a heartbeat, the field had come alive again. Later, I walked the length of the cemetery. The names blurred together: Dupont, Lefebvre, Morel, Bernard, and then, finally, Mercier. My name, his. I reached out and brushed the letters carved into the stone. The coolness of it steadied me. That evening, I sat by the edge of the meadow and opened my notebook. I had come intending to write a short reflection for the family records, but instead, I found myself writing to Julian directly. It wasn't planned. The words just came. "You asked for something to be planted," I wrote. "I have planted remembrance, not in the ground, but in our blood. You are not forgotten." And as I wrote, I realized how memory changes shape over time. It stops being about mourning and becomes instead a way of continuing, a quiet tending of something that grows, even in absence. When I returned home to Lyon, I decided to plant a garden. Not a grand one, but a small patch behind the house. I filled it with wildflowers, lavender and thyme, the same scents that had lingered in Verdun's fields. Each spring since, I've tended it carefully. When the wind moves through it, the air carries that same fragrance I first smelled in the soil where Julian was found. A mix of rain, memory, and something older still. Sometimes neighbors stop and ask why I chose such ordinary flowers. I tell them they're not ordinary at all. Each one, in its fragile bloom, defies the silence that war tried to leave behind. Through Julian's letter, I've come to see remembrance not as a monument, but as a living thing, something you nurture, something that breathes. His words, written in mud and fear, were never meant to glorify or accuse. They were a seed, a hope that what was broken might someday heal. Now, when I walk through the garden at dusk, I can almost hear him, the whisper of the leaves, the rustle of bees in the lavender. It all feels like language, soft and endless. Perhaps this is what he meant when he asked for something to be planted. Not merely flowers, but a conversation that continues. Julian's letter taught me that remembrance is not about holding on to sorrow. It's about carrying forward what love left behind, the courage to keep tending life even after everything has fallen quiet. The war took him, but it also gave back something unexpected, the knowledge that silence too can speak, and that the smallest act of care can bridge a century. Each time I kneel to pull a weed or brush dirt from my hands, I think of that boy in the trench, writing by candlelight to whoever might one day find him, and I whisper back, "We found you, we planted, we remember." Barefoot laughing, the sleeves of his shirt rolled up, his hands smelling of grass. I imagine him turning to look at the sunlight on the leaves, and I realize that what endures is not the sound of cannons or the echo of command, but that very stillness, the moment before everything changed. The letter, now more than a century old, has become a bridge. I think often about how fragile it is. Paper that survived when thousands of bodies did not. How it endured rain, mud and time, protected only by a folded piece of oilcloth and a will to be found. In that endurance, there is something holy. When I visit schools or small history circles, I bring a copy of it. I read Julian's words aloud to rooms that fall utterly silent. Students look up from their desks, their faces softened by something they can't yet name. I tell them, he wasn't older than you are now, and that always lands. The realization that history is not ancient, it is personal. It has a pulse. Afterwards, someone always asks, why do you think he wrote it? I tell them I don't think Julian wrote out of fear or despair. I think he wrote out of a need to plant something. Words were his seeds. He sowed them in the soil of a world still burning, trusting that someday someone, anyone, would find them and let them grow. That perhaps is what remembrance truly is. Not a monument, not even a name carved in stone, but the act of tending to the living. The courage to keep nurturing what war tried to erase. Each of us, in small ways, carries the duty Julian left behind, to plant, to speak, to remember. When I visited Verdun one last time, before returning home for good, the wildflowers had multiplied. They covered the meadow like a soft quilt, yellow and violet and white. I bent down and touched them, and in the hush of that place, I thought I heard a kind of music, wind through petals, insects humming low, the distant toll of a bell from the village. It was the sound of life refusing to yield. And it struck me then that Julian's request had been answered 1,000-fold, not just by me, but by every blade of grass that rose where he once stood, every hand that had reached down to tend the soil. His letter had become the very thing he asked for, something that grows. Sometimes at night, I light a single candle beside his photograph and sit for a while in the quiet. The flame flickers, and its reflection wavers across the glass frame. There, between shadow and light, I see him as he must have been the night he wrote, tired, cold, but unbroken. "Tell her I am not lost," he wrote. "The earth already has, and I finally understand." To be claimed by the earth is not to be erased. It is to return to something vaster than memory. It is to belong endlessly to everything that follows. The war ended long ago, but the echoes remain, not of destruction, but of endurance. The fields of Verdun bloom now, the birds return each spring, and the soil, heavy with history, still gives life. That, I think, is what the dead asked of us. Not grief, but growth. So if ever you walk where they once fell, pause. Look closely at the ground beneath your feet. It breathes, it remembers, and if this story has touched your heart, dear reader, please like, share, and subscribe so these lost voices may continue to be heard, their small words still finding life in the hearts of those who listen.